Crash Course.
Crash Course.
Crash Course. 150th episode special. Hey, where'd you guys go on my 9th? You ducked out on my 9th. You just left me. High and dry.
I can't count that high. I count to 8.
That's unfortunate.
8 bars, 8 measures.
I drifted in and out, honestly.
Super 8.
Well, the sentiment is the same. It's the 150th episode special. I want support.
Well,
No.
No.
It's important to you, too.
Oh, it's way more important to me. That's why I'm giving you shit.
Now we're really throwing our balls around on how much we care about our own mutual product.
You stay away from
That's
my
great.
balls, damn it.
All right, fine. Actually, we're the same exact length from each other's balls for 150 episodes straight.
That's true.
Yeah. With
no.
minute differences and minute scene changes and studio changes.
But I
and
think
so
we've
forth.
always been the same distance apart.
That's true. Yeah, true. Eyes locked.
Breathing heavy.
Yeah. Every once in a while, heaving.
My mind's
We're
just
making
going.
John awkward.
Well, it's clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. This entire time we've been doing
No,
this.
clown to the left of you, joker to the right. It is a singular case. Thank you.
Not if I cross my eyes, then it's double vision.
That's true, actually.
That is very true.
We have to fit the lyrics.
Yeah. Of course, welcome to the podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm John.
And I'm Steve.
This is as we said, our 150th episode special. It's been 3 years that we've been doing the podcast. As of a few weeks from when this comes out, it'll be 1 year anniversary of Crash Chords Autographs, our first spin-off podcast from the main show. And we're excited to bring you yet another episode on the 50 mark where we do something a little different. For the 50th and the 100th, we did something a little different, and this time we're doing the same. Steve, why don't you let the audience know a little bit about it?
All right, well, first of all, they're a unique chance for a kind of reaffirmation of the mission statement. These episodes formally end our episodic season, and they're the midpoint of our review seasons, which sync up with the new year and culminate in our year in review episodes, which fall every episode 25, 75, 125 for the naysayer. At some point, we're going to have to decide how we're going to divvy up the box sets. Do you want to go by episodic or by review?
We're going to have to do part 1, part 2 season-wise.
Yeah.
And that sort of a situation.
Well,
Break it up by year, but like half a year.
Ideally, we're going to have a fiscal season at some point, and maybe we can go by that.
Right, well, we'd have to be making money first.
We can only hope.
But then we'd be playing up the Wall Street players way that they do. The banking
Well, we're going to have
we're
to
gonna do fiscal
consult
scene.
them, and they'll be our lawyers.
Well,
essentially.
that and
Lawyers,
they
you
can
mean
tell us-
accountants?
Well, both. Hopefully one of them is a lawyer, I think.
Well, just money guys. They're going to be our money guys.
Money guys,
There
all
we
right,
go.
yeah, we know a lot about money, clearly. In either case, with the year in reviews focusing solely on the artists we look at and being the bulk of our work, we try to celebrate our birthday in a unique way every year, and of course, trying to stay up to date and self-aware in the process. So first, let's look at the first 2 of our anniversaries. The first anniversary / 50th episode special was a reflection on our main subject, that subject, of course, being music. So we took a step out of our comfort zone and discussed music and its relationship with other forms of art, even going so far to pin them against each other, art versus music versus movies versus gaming and the like. While the second anniversary / 100th episode special was a reflection on ourselves and on the Crash Chords podcast as a whole, essentially putting our own product right in our own analytical crosshairs. There you'll hear much about how we started, what we do, how we do it, what we're trying to do, and what we're not doing yet. Well, today's episode is another kind of reflection. It's a reflection on the power and breadth of the medium itself, the music podcast. So now the crosshairs are aimed at our peers, because you see, we're a podcast, you should know that, and it's a very broad and daunting form of media. It's redefining itself every day. There's no one way to go about a podcast, and yet there's probably a million wrong or unwise ways to go about a podcast, specifically a music podcast. And I don't mean the kinds that feature continuous playlists of music without any chatting. That's a great way to discover new music, but to me that's the work of folks who fancy themselves disc jockeys. It's a whole different animal. I'm talking about our immediate peers, those who discuss music, and we're going to be discussing the manner in which they discuss it and what they value. So before we go into them, let's get ourselves out of the way here. For any wandering podcaster, for us the values are very simple, if constantly in refinement. They are analysis, discussion, description, debate, review, cross-analysis, basically whatever we have to do to give these artists a fair shake and our listeners some kind of meaningful outlet, especially if they feel underwhelmed by the kind of knee-jerk reactions that many critics are trained to have and paid to contribute. Education is a much bigger part of our game, and we impart what we can when we can, but ultimately, we're on 2 quests. A quest for substantial discourse, it's what we do, and a quest for fresh albums, most of which I think all 3 of us would admit to otherwise never unpacking with such blind devotion, were it not for this mission. And these pillars make 150 episodes of this more than worthwhile, and we're constantly refining that approach. For others with the same passion, other tenets may yet guide their podcasting style. I'm going to get into a quick disclaimer here. The names that we're about to mention, the podcasts we're about to look at, by no means represent a comprehensive list. There's a lot of music podcasts out there, and this is merely our, in part, arbitrary selection of what stood out to us, and our review or our overview of what formats exist, what's possible, what works, what doesn't, what we like, what we don't, what we can learn from, what we should be doing.
Well said.
All right.
All right.
It was a mouthful.
It was a mouthful.
Even from my spiels, and I have spiels.
That's true. You can spiel with the best of them.
I can.
So yeah, and also it's important to note, we might have some critiques of the podcast as far as from a listener standpoint, but we are by no means saying we're better than them. That's not the goal of this. The goal is to compare contemporaries within the medium.
Exactly.
Because it's hard to know what you're doing if you don't look at what's being done.
It's as I said, peers. You're on the same level, essentially. You're all trying to do a similar thing, but in a different way. We're going to start out with a podcast called Song Exploder, which I feel is a more technical podcast. And we do tend to get pretty technical, but these guys, it's straight from the horse's mouth. It's from the artists themselves explaining how their songs are made and put together. And there's not much of a host present in the mix.
I just want to take a moment to thank Nelson Lugo, who had actually recommended this podcast to me, though Steve had found it independently when we were at, both of us were at Kita and Fernando's wedding, which congratulations to them. I guess I can say that on the air since we're mentioning it. Nelson was a guest to the wedding as well, and he mentioned Song Exploder. He's like, it's like what you guys do, but on the song level, and probably not that overly simplistic, which is pretty much fairly accurate. So thank you, Nelson, for suggesting that. So let's get into Song Exploder. I just want to say, me and Steve listened to different episodes. We did sample it a bit also before recording today. I had picked an episode, although we'd both independently picked episodes of bands that we had reviewed on the podcast previously.
Exactly. And to go back to what you said about like overly simplistic, the thing is it's all relative. And if you look back through our compendium of podcasts and you go early on, yes, of course we were overly simplistic. We were new at what we did.
Yeah.
We're 150 episodes deep, and you'll probably find some where we're probably over-complicating the matter sometimes.
Sure.
But this is a different kind of thing. This is not really a matter of like a critical analysis where you might be oversimplifying or overcomplicating. Instead, it's just a matter of the facts. This is how the song was made. You can't really get around that, and you're hearing it from the artists themselves.
And that first person point of view is a little bit different than what I'd come to know as music reviews or music designing or any of these discussions that we actually get to have on both this podcast and when we're listening to things. This first person point of view,
I mean, straight from the horse's mouth, essentially.
That's
Gotta
really
love that phrase.
Yeah.
a very unique idea to hear a drummer or a guitarist or a vocalist actually saying, well, here's how we start, and to the next point, this is what we added on to it, but here's where the melody originally comes from.
Well, here's their tagline. Song Exploder, a podcast where musicians take apart their songs and piece by piece tell the story of how they were made. That's pretty basic. And the episodes reflecting that, they're rather short. They're normally just as long as it would take to describe the demo process and as it leads through to the layering process and what other ideas came out in post-production.
What's interesting also is the podcast opens with a snippet of that song that was chosen. Mm-hmm. Then often from there they go to the bassist demo level of the first version of the song. Usually it's a piano line or a guitar riff, something very scratch and very simple. And then from there they expand on each track and talk about it. But you do get a little preview of what they're going to be talking about musically at the very beginning of the show.
Right. Well, let's go to an episode that I looked at, which was, of course, also in a band that we looked at, and that was Spoon. In this particular case, they had only one member of Spoon, and that was Jim Eno, who was the drummer. And he breaks down specifically, because they really only look at one song, so they look at one artist, and for the length of this podcast, of this episode, they look at just one song. In this case, this track was Inside Out, and explained how it went from the original demo to the finished album version, including what other music sort of influenced the recording, or what influenced the process. Apparently, Spoon is really keen on developing things against what other artists might do. So they might imagine, all right, here's my chordal progression, right? And he starts off just with the bare bones demo. The demo is not what the drummer contributed, but one of the other fellow band members just sits there with his upright piano and just starts hammering out a few chords. And once he's got that down, then he sings along, and you're just hearing this raw recording of upright piano and vocals. It sounds actually kind of beautiful in of itself. And then he hands that off to the band. So Jim Eno described that as being the first way he heard the song himself.
What's nice about this is it's sort of like those songs you get in the demo cuts, the release cuts, the sort of special edition CDs that a band will produce, 4 or 5 albums in, and have the session pieces. Mm-hmm. This way you get an alternate version of the song. But through these episodes, you're getting 2, 3, 4 different versions, and you actually see the evolutionary process. This is an incredible insight into the workings of the mind of the artist, for artists, and that's a really cool aspect of this podcast, is that as much as it's fun as a listener and a lover of a specific band or a specific song, it also is a cool tool for other artists to look at and to see, well, here's how they kind of went in this direction. Here's where they got their inspiration. How can I do things like that? And that in and of itself it's sort of a very, very friendly version of a how-to book.
Yeah, it's entirely educational, I think. I mean, some people may just be like, oh yeah, it's cool how you made it, but I feel like there has to be some kind of vested interest in this. That vested interest is probably going to come from a fellow musician, especially someone who maybe feels like they're, falling behind on like the how-tos, or they lack the technical knowledge. Well, there are processes to these things, and the processes are known by artists who've been in the business for a long time, and of course the music producer, who also steps in here, and his name is Dave Friedman, whose other credits are pretty substantial. They include the Flaming Lips album Soft Bulletin, and also the album Oracular Spectacular by MGMT.
So, also important to note is that I had actually listened to a different episode than Steve. And something to note about this podcast is it's definitely one where you would go to it, look at the list of songs, and go, well, I know that band and that band and that band. I'm going to listen to those 3 episodes.
Yeah.
Which there's nothing wrong with that.
How people probably approach us.
I guarantee.
We realized that actually kind of late in the game. Remember when our episodes were...
Didn't have the album.
They had just like Crash Chords Podcast episode, 19. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean for anybody? Of course, we all had blurbs since the beginning, but, blurbs, you have to go into it.
Yeah,
even
if you're
that
on
one
iTunes,
paragraph,
you don't really see the full blurb.
You don't see that.
Either.
You got to click the little I, and it's tiny, and I don't know. People aren't going to do that. They're gonna go by titles. And that, in general, with music podcasts, people gravitate toward what they like. And then hopefully, if they like the delivery and the approach of the podcast
they'll try new stuff too.
Exactly.
And so the episode I listened to is another band and another album we had done, and it was Garbage, and their album Not Your Kind of People, and the song from the album Felt, which is one of those songs that we all really felt was one of the higher quality tracks on the record.
And for the sake of reference purposes, we reviewed Spoon back in episode 108, and we reviewed Garbage back in episode 28.
And so on this episode, they speak to 3 different people. Butch Vig, who's one of the most famous modern rock producers, who's also a member of Garbage. Shirley Manson, the lead singer of Garbage, someone I've had a crush on since high school, and could listen to talk about anything in her Scottish accent forever while it melts my brain. That aside, behind us, they also speak to Billy Bush, who's one of the engineers for Garbage. And they talk about how... What I like about this episode is not only does Butch Vig go into, of course... how the song came to be, but they also talk about how Garbage came to be a little bit, because it's fairly well known, but I like always hearing the story how the members of Garbage, the men in the band, pretty much all of the people who play instruments, were just producers who were in a band. They also played instruments. And they put a band together. It was all instrumental, and they released some songs, and they were like, wow, this stinks. We're missing something. Like, we need something else.
It seems like almost a no-brainer and simultaneously a really challenging thing for a producer to be in a band themselves. You think they're with music all day. Well, they have to have some ideas themselves. They can't just, work with other people. But also, if they're spending so much time working with other people, they might feel like they don't have the time for that kind of, like, self-possessed environment. As in many ways, they really should have the right to.
Sure. But then the band talks about how they were looking for something else, and then they meet this young, poor Scottish girl named Shirley Manson.
That sounds like an old American tale, if anything.
Right, which is what's beautiful about it, but she has this gorgeous voice, and it's sort of a rags to riches tale, but it's not in the fact, because they weren't huge hits overnight, but, I mean, they were successful pretty much from the first record on, and grew and grew. But Shirley Manson is one of those people who came from a tough background, and it shows in her music. And she talks about that. How writing these songs, a lot of them come from a personal place and where the lyrics come from. And it's just, I think it's fascinating when the bands not just talk about how the song was made, but also sometimes how the band was made.
Well, it sounds like she stepped a little bit out of herself for the sake of this episode, considering that most Song Exploder episodes, as far as I've seen, do tend to really stick close to the technical. We have another example later of instances where they can get a little bit more emotional. But, like, for instance, in the case of Jim Eno, he really sticks pretty close to the process. I already explained the thing about the demo process, with the upright piano and whatnot. That's just what he heard first. And then all of a sudden, they were thinking, like, all right, well, let's try to make this sound like other artists. Dr. Dre. And they considered that, and they considered certain little elements here, and then we get another demo, which they play over in the episode, which is just like the bare instrumentation. They also talk about how, like, they took the drums and tried to replace that then with the sample kit, and they tried to get more of, like, a hip-hop punch to it as they went. But then he also talks about other things, like how the solos it came out of, like, Marvin Gaye, the kind of really swelling, orchestral solos that might be in, like, the middle of a Marvin Gaye track. That's what they did here with, like, this harp solo. And there were several harp solos toward the end. And I remember in our episode when we reviewed that was, like, one of the highlights of not just the song but of the album. So I was really intrigued that an idea that almost seemed like happenstance, just picking it from out of the blue, like, what would this sound like if we did Marvin Gaye? All of a sudden, that ended up being one of, like, the key points of the track, and I never even thought of that in the course of the album, but that's where it came from.
And what's really nice is that all this exploded view of the song itself is really showing influences. It's showing the artists themselves. It's giving a little bit of the core personality that you may not get in tabloid magazines or in little snippets of reviews or in just press releases and things like that. Having those little bits here and there, seeing them pulling from things like Marvin Gaye, really shows that, well, this is maybe the sort of music they like or listen to. It gives personality to what was just potentially an instrument on a record you heard.
Exactly. And also going back to the producer does, I think he's hearing a phone call. He's not in the same room as Jimmy. I don't think it was a direct interview, but he steps in at least to contribute a little bit in his part. And his explanation behind his work as producer is really presenting a buffet of options. Like, these are things that you can do. Obviously, you're the artist at the end of the day, and you can make the choice. So I give you what you can do with this track, and then you kind of choose it in the end. And I thought that's a very egalitarian way to go about producers, because some producers can be kind of hard asses.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of horror stories from artists on that.
Also, I want to jump back to something that Steven mentioned. Be clear that even though they did get into the history of the band and an emotional side of that song, Butch Vig dove very deep into the technicalities of the scratch track, where it first started, how they built the guitars, how they built the drums, how they put it together. And Shirley also got into the very particular minute points of the lyrical flow, how she came up with the lyrics, where they came from, the wording, the rewrites, all of this stuff. So what I think is truly interesting about both episodes that I've heard now, and what would make me go back to this podcast, is that the host really he introduces the podcast, but he kind of lets the artist take the reins. And it's really interesting, especially if you're really into the artist. Who wouldn't want to hear, like I said earlier, it from the horse's mouth? Who doesn't want that perspective?
That's the big point I want to address here, is that the host really is completely silent for the duration. He exists in the beginning and the end. He's the bump. He introduces it. He does what I would do, in the course of, if I was just this spiel, and then I just shut up for the remainder. And of course I never shut up, so I'm always just yabbering on. In his case, he leaves. He's just like, I don't know, he lets them go, because it almost kind of makes sense. And we had some contention with this over the course of, listening to these podcasts, and whether you might prefer a host being more of a present figure, and whether you'd rather than just take a back seat. But there are really times during interviews where you would just kind of want the interviewer to shut up. It really all depends on the interviewer's conversational style, but the main draw for an audience is always the artist. The only reason to even have an interviewer present is to steer the artist toward the most interesting questions. But in a format like this, in Song Exploder, the questions kind of speak for themselves. The only person who knows how the song is put together is the artist themselves. So the best person to steer him is him.
Yeah. And also, it's one of those things where, for example, on Autographs, if you've listened to our other podcast, it's very conversational. But I am directing the artist in talking about several topics. It's not a specific topic and we're expecting to expand on it. Those conversations are steered because let's talk about everything. I mean, some of the podcasts have had only a ancillary thing to do with music, and had also been talking, like, with Graham Elwood, all we talked about was podcasting, which was fascinating. But you might not have gotten that with just a set of questions emailed to a person that they answered. You know, the conversation was steered that way.
You know what it also omits? The guessing game.
Yeah.
Because at the, like, an interviewer can only prompt something if he has a good idea of, like, where it might lead. Or, of course, then maybe if he doesn't know, then he would just be asking a very broad question, and they wouldn't seem like very key questions. It was just like, well, tell me how this happened, although I have no idea yet. He's kind of like trying to be a stand-in for what the listener might be thinking, but again, sometimes it's just process. It's just a clear process. And I do find that over the course of what we do, we might run into a little bit of a problem, because we, of course, spend so much time playing that guessing game. We're sitting here, and sometimes we have a little tangential discussion about, like, oh, it sounds like he's kind of trying to do this with the music. It sounds like he's trying to, like, you know, layer that in, but it seems like that was the core and that was the fundamental. We really don't know in the end. Which is why I always try to, like, steer our conversations away from that when we get to that point, because, you know, we'll get caught up on how to describe it, which is really only the preface to our primary goal, which is really describing not what it is, but how it works. So that's always been a problem with our format, which is why we're almost a tiny bit two-faced. For the description segment, having an artist pop in to say, like, hey, this is how I did it, could really come in handy for what we do. But then we just shoo them away as we start to get critical. It's ironic.
But at the same time, sometimes those little parts of trying to extrapolate where an artist was coming from can be really enjoyable. Why is he doing something like this? Well, maybe he was in this frame of mind. Maybe he was doing from this sort of a reference. Maybe he's just doing something because he knows how to do it. Maybe he's trying something different because he knows he wants to be different. It's interesting to see where the rabbit hole can really go when you're trying to come up with reasons behind somebody when you just don't know.
Well, let's put a little question here then. Me and you listen to separate episodes. I listen to Spoon. You listen to the Garbage episode. Did you and we found that there were two very, very different reactions here. In your case, it did go to more of like an emotional place.
Well, it was both. It existed in both worlds.
More technical.
I mean,
it was both, and it was kind of back and forth on each. Do you think that a host could have better pulled something out of that?
No, I think it was organic. I think that when you have the lyricist talking about the lyrics, it's gonna go to an emotional pace because you have the exact meaning of the song, the words that were created. It only naturally, especially for a song like Felt, which is an emotionally charged song, it only makes sense that you would go that direction.
So you'd equate it to more of a journal entry than anything, and Song Exploder is merely an outlet for that public journal entry.
I mean, I guess for that specific part of the song, but keep in mind both the producer, the engineer, and Butch Vig, a member of the band, both stayed very technical because they were talking about the instrumentation. I think very clearly because she's writing from a personal place, of course the lead singer is going to get somewhat emotional because there's actual meaning in the words, what they mean, where they came from.
Gotcha.
But even at the same time, I don't always want exact meaning of a song. I don't want to have, you know, the shroud of mystery removed from certain words or phrases or melody pieces. I like being able to invest my own idea into something like that.
Then you wouldn't listen to Song Exploder.
Not always.
But that's what I'm saying is that's Song Exploder is taking it apart at a technical level, and that emotional connection is part of the technical level because it's how she wrote it and why she wrote it.
I would flat out describe it as a whole, if I was going to recommend it to anyone, as like a brief, straightforward behind the scenes on the part of the artist. And I do think it's incredibly valuable for that reason. No criticism, just process. You know, just pure process. And I think there's a huge market out there for that. If you want something that's a little bit more on the side of what perhaps we broached in that particular example, that particular episode, something a little bit more grounded in inspiration, then you might enjoy the second podcast on our list, Tap to Music, hosted by Nick Johnson. And the tagline here goes, Tap to Music podcast revolves around inspiration and how it is used by music artists of all genres to create their original music. Each featured artist on the show takes the role of the inspirator, which almost feels like a coined word on their part, as they give a creative tour of their life as a passionate music artist. On Tap to Music, you will learn new habits, gain skills, and pick up tricks that help you write music and stay inspired. Each inspirator hand picks one of their original songs and shares it with you, the listener. If you find this show inspirational, then please pass on the inspiration with a friend or family member, because we here at Tap to Music launch every episode with the intention of helping you enjoy the music you listen to on a deeper level. Well, the end of that sounds very close to our mission statement in a way, helping you enjoy the thing on a deeper level. But of course, we lack the artist present.
Sure.
These guys have it. And the funny thing is, when he goes into that middle portion, on Tap to Music you will learn new habits, gain skills, and pick up tricks. It almost seems like a bit of a departure of what the episode actually is, and more of a sort of pigeonholing off of what Song Exploder is. But it doesn't seem like they do that. Instead, it's more toward your secondary series, for instance, Crash Chords Autographs, which is an interview show, and you get to kind of explore, well, frankly, whatever you want to.
Right.
But you're probably going to get both of that, both process and inspiration.
Well, yeah. I think that they're both educational for different reasons. One's the more technical aspect, and one's more the inspirational writing aspect. I mean, when people tell you how to write, they're not really telling you how to write.
Yeah.
They're telling you how they write, and you pick apart what you can pull from it.
Exactly.
And it sounds like that's what this is doing. So the episode we sampled and that I had listened to was with Aaron Jones and the Way, or Aaron Jones, actually is how it's pronounced, and the Way. And the interesting thing about that one for specific is that it starts very, very kind of nonchalantly. We get a sample of the music, and then the host just comes right in, like I would on Autographs, and then talks about it. I mean, the major difference between this and Autographs is I don't sample the work of the artist, because I leave that up to the listener to go investigate. We could. It's not a thing that I was against. It's just not something I had wanted to do in the outset.
Well, you sample a lot. You sample most of it, but you're not past, playing the role of the foreign interviewer. Who's
it's not. I sample their music personally. We don't play it on the show, whereas this show does.
Oh, gotcha.
But what's interesting here is, it comes from a place where they're just trying to find out how the artist works on any level, and they're looking to dig from what the artist has to say.
From taking specific songs and talking about the pre-production as opposed to Song Exploder's idea of during and post-production, it gives you that sort of creative insight. It's enjoyable just for the fact of where minds can go. Just how do you come up with this sort of an idea? How do you come up with that sort of an idea?
Well,
that little bit of insight, that little bit of just, sort of the emotional place that songs come from can be really, really interesting. Though not always like the super informative that Song Exploder does.
Right. Well, because this has a very passionate host who, participates not just in the intros, but in the course of the interview himself. And he sounds the delivery is important here. I mean, there really is no delivery on Song Exploder because it's going to be a different delivery every time with each artist. But here, the delivery is pretty constant. He sort of starts off by this sort of slow, like spiritual music playing in the background, and he speaks very, very softly and down to earth. I don't know. He's from New Mexico. Maybe they have a more in touch with their spiritual side. Who knows? I don't know. Being out in the desert and whatnot. But it's very like slow and relaxed, and especially that interview style when he's actually talking to the person is very. It's trying to get down to the personal stuff, It's almost like that NPR tone or that Jazz 88 tone where they're just very, very soft and almost trying to soothe you into the night, but also to try to put the artist into that place himself, to try to pull the best or the worst out of the process or where he was, what his frame of mind was when he wrote it. So for instance, I listened to the debut episode out of this because it's a fairly new podcast. It hasn't been around that long. I think they only have maybe a little bit over a dozen episodes released, and I listened to the debut, which featured Kevin Hierig, and this is the first episode, not episode 00, where they
it's
actually
like
just
an intro to what they're going to do.
Intro to the whole podcast series. But in the case of Kevin Hierig, he starts off with some generic questions. He invites on the artists, and he's first asking what has he listened to growing up? Those are some of the obvious interview questions. And then it's, what are your favorite lyrics? What was your worst writer's block? And he starts getting really into the writing process. He asked that on the
episode I listened to also.
Yeah.
So I think that's a regular for him.
Some go-to things upon which he can actually get, very diverse answers.
Mm-hmm. Taking all this, I mean, it becomes an argument of, left brain, right brain, inspiration versus perspiration. The two podcasts are very different takes on sort of the same sort of process. Where's the song originating from? These two combinations give you kind of like a palette for either thing you want to go into. Mm-hmm. This inspiration process, honestly, the episode we listened to on 2 Feet, the Stand with Aaron Jones, you said it was pronounced?
Aaron.
Was really interesting to see what the frame of reference, the coloration between the lines of the bars that he's setting on the pieces of paper. That I found to be a really cool, like, insight into just one artist, one bit on one piece.
Mm-hmm. But also, I think the major difference is, while they both do seem like different sides of the same coin, the second podcast, Tapped Music, is definitely more interview focused. It's more conversational focused, whereas the first one is much more technical.
But yet, also, there's sort of a tack onto that. In the course of being more interview focused, it does seem like there's a slightly scripted nature to it. Like, obviously there's that long intro and everything, but then the questions themselves do, like, as I said, they tend to be constant questions. They do vary. They definitely vary, but they're things he wants to kind of like anchor all artists back to, maybe for the purposes of putting them on the exact same plane.
Well, this inspirational plane, it sounds like the goal is to get the inspiration of the artist, and so maybe all the questions are a way to do that.
But also the same, like, rating is the wrong word, but the same plane as far as what he's inquiring of. If the interviewer is constantly shuffling around their questions, then all of a sudden you have the capacity to have a really weak interview on one hand and then a really strong interview on another, just because you were asking the right questions in one and maybe the wrong questions in the other. I think he has a goal, and he set this out, especially considering he had an episode 00. Not all podcasts do that, but many do, especially if they have a really, really firm idea of where they're going in the future. And it seems like he did.
I mean, and I think that's a fair observation. I mean,
even in terms of the coined word, who coins a word if you're not going to, like, apply it to a product?
I mean, not everybody can come up with synth-instrumental.
Synth-instrumental. Well,
that one.
Yeah, I must have coined that, like, deep into the series, though.
Right.
Or maybe I just, like, started saying it as, like, a silly word, and then I was like, you know what? I'm writing it down.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah,
let's make it official.
It works.
I think what I really enjoy about this podcast, I mean, I think I first off, I want to say I enjoyed both podcasts, but I think what I really liked about Tapped Music is that it does feel more emotionally charged, even though it doesn't really have to be. I think it's because of that soft voice and the NPR feel. It does give this kind of more emotional grounding to it.
And I'm back and forth. I would probably, maybe as a musician, I would prefer Song Exploder more, because it really is perhaps the better learning tool. I think in the case of Tap to Music, this is the kind of thing where it's going to vary so much from artist to artist, because how can you teach inspiration? You really can't, and that's why, I mean, I don't know, that's the only little thing with that intro paragraph, learn new habits, gain skills, pick up tricks. This is going to vary from person to person,
sure.
More so than I think in Song Exploder. Song Exploder is like production. At the end of the day, you are going to be coming back to the same things. You're going to be using a digital audio software. You're going to have a workstation. You're going to have an interface. You're going to, different types of mics that you use, different types of effects that you might apply on top of that. That's where you get the producer's thing. So it's just, in that case, the technical stuff may very well lead to the inspiration. I as far as Tap to Music is concerned, it's just cool to hear about, what led them. It's more of an emotional place, I agree.
And also Tap to Music is one of those things where, as a fan of music, I really enjoyed it more, I think, because, like, after hearing the interview with Aaron Jones, I emailed him to do an interview, which, good news, he's going to be on Autograph sometime in July or August. Which is awesome.
Now you can really ask about his experience on this podcast.
But also, it got me into his music. His music was really good, so now I wanted to hear it.
Yeah.
Because of the way he talked about it in depth.
That's a big perk. I love his selection. I was really a fan of Kevin Herrig's music. I thought, he has almost this, like, sort of cool indie style, like coffee shop vibe, but it's a lot more complex. Really, really, in inviting chord progressions. He immerses you right in. So I think the tone is appropriate. I think that Nick Johnson knows exactly what he's doing with the artist that he's picking. As well. He's not going to put himself in a position where he's going to get an artist who's just, like, stunned on these questions and just not going to know how to answer them, or is going to find, I did it for money. That would be a big letdown, I think, for Nick Johnson.
All right, from here we'll go to another podcast that's a little different from the previous two we talked about. The next one is Music A to Z.
I am really excited about this one, because this is one that I've been listening to a little bit longer. Not every episode, because, of course, it's tough, but their tagline goes very simply, understanding music one band at a time. It also continues in another area of the site. Each week, Steve and Doug Ferguson go through another letter of the alphabet to bring you an artist of possible interest. Now, this struck me as a little strange at first. At first, it was almost like, well, that's really arbitrary. Just a letter in any band in the world, and it goes. But, it's a guide, if anything. It's just a format with which they can just start working through bands. For us, we're really, just reaching into either our own experience with bands. Of course, everybody knows we cycle through, Matt picks an album, John picks an album, Steve picks an album, and we cycle around week to week to week. That way, we are always constantly at least keeping each other apprised of new bands, and sometimes we reach into the depths ourselves to bands that none of us would pick, but we often come out very surprised. In their case, it's just it's an engine to keep them going through bands. And at first I thought that, well, you're going to go through A to Z, and what do you got to do then? They come up with themes. I don't know if there was a theme for the first set, but there was a theme for the second set, and that was strictly Canadian artists. They're from Vancouver, so they have a vested interest in Canadian artists, and frankly, everyone should have a vested interest in Canadian artists.
A lot of great bands in Canada.
A lot of greats.
I will point out, being from Vancouver, you should have pronounced that A to Z, because our Canadian brethren don't say Z.
They do say Z. They said the Z in one of they said the Z in one of the
did
episodes.
In fact say
yeah.
Z. And in being Canadian, you have to get that right.
That's right. Well, that's
the
our
episode
flawed American.
from that cycle that we all focused on was Owen Pallette, which was a musician we had done. Now, it was a little bit different to see them tackling a discography as opposed to when we tackled a single album. And it was kind of weird actually seeing, sort of through their eyes, the evolution of a single individual.
That's the big thing here. I mean, the format seems pretty straightforward. It's just two dudes chatting about, kind of almost the way we started. Just, all right, people chatting about it. It's very casual. In that sense, it's almost kind of rooted in a I don't know, I hate to say the word grassroots kind of podcast. I guess many podcasts are grassroots in a sense. But, it's very, very casual. It's very conversational. But it's that discographical thing which I find to be the most ambitious. Their big thing is, of course, instead of going through the album in as much depth as we do on each and every episode, they go through the artist, which is in some ways a lot more ambitious, but also really broad. I'd say that there's some pros and cons to both of these, but I see more of a kindred thing going on here between them and us for at least that ambition. Let's call them our West Coast Canadian counterparts. They're guys with, nominal credentials, but a lot of experience now. In fact, one guy has been reviewing, at least online, for, 10 years. They have 50 episodes running, at least in the course of this series, and a huge passion for what they do. Their episodes are also of comparable length to ours, and they spend a week with not just an album, but every album an artist has released. So, the same amount of time spent on an album as we spend on a song. It's going to bound to, curtail the album-level discussion a little bit, but you kind of get more into the artist.
But there's also a major difference is they're not reviewing these artists. They are simply talking about them.
Exactly.
So losing those details from album to album because they're looking at it more abroad is less of an issue because they're just having a discussion.
Well, no, here's the thing. They don't review in the same way, but even though we don't really review in the same way either. We analyze and discuss. Eventually it comes down to a one-by-one monologue toward the end of our analysis. But it's strictly discussion at that point.
Sure.
And for them, it also is mostly strictly discussion within which they do have opinions. It's not all just, informative. They definitely infuse that review element. So it's unfair to say that they don't review. They just don't have, a big chart like we do. But also, we know that we don't advertise the chart. It's secondary. The discussion comes first, and always has.
And one of the cool features of having this more broad album-oriented, as artist-oriented, instead of just a singular album, is that we get a lot of history and context for what the artist is going through, where he starts, and where he may in fact be headed. Because when you start discussing, well, this album came out in this year, here's what he was also doing as a side project. Or this album came out when he first started branching out on his own. This is maybe why we started getting themes of this sort in his music. It's an interesting kind of perspective on what the artist is doing.
Well, they feature some of those questions in another area of their site here. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Music A to Z, to make John and hopefully them happy. The podcast where we explore music and the artists that make it. Is it talent or commercial? Is big label or is indie? That's how it's written. Is good or should it be consigned to the darkest regions of hell for all eternity to torture the devil with? So they definitely have opinions. Join us as we figure that all out every week in alphabetical order. Every week we cover a new band or artist looking at their history and discography. We talk about our experience with them and then delve into their live shows and finally our recommendations. This current run for the alphabet is our look at Canadian music you may not have heard of, but probably should listen to. Full of humor, insight, and education, Music A to Z will keep you entertained for hours. That's very promotional. But here's the thing. With all of that, I mean, they do address a lot of the same questions that we address over the course, at least, of our, point-by-point discussions. It's just, we could spend a lot of time talking about a single measure. Or rather, I should say, I spend a lot of time talking about a single measure.
We hold our own in a lot of those discussions, yeah.
It's 150. You get there.
They instead start talking about things like theme work or the longer melody of a specific song that stood out. And these little tidbits really can just... They show evolution in such a way that you really only get to sit with if you're already into a band. And for them to really start pulling from the hat of grabbing A to Z or A to Z is really cool because you're getting exposed to just a very somewhat arbitrary but very varied group of artists.
Exactly. Well, this is a somewhat arbitrary but very varied group of podcasts. Here's the thing. As a result of it, I think knowing the artist more intimately than the individual work, they do wind up being more research-oriented than us. I said that up front, and I want to go into those details here. Even like the long spiels I write for certain artists, they don't always get into their whole background. They're more of an op-ed overview so that we can jump off into the album and we can sort of look at where they're at this current place in time, given the work we're about to review. Also, I haven't even done that for our whole history. We were kind of lazy in the early days. I started really staying strict with the spiels lately. But we started by mentioning the Owen Pallette episode, and that's what we all looked at here. The Owen Pallette episode, he starts off giving those research, things that we didn't, giving the research that we really didn't address, giving things like he started playing violin lessons at age 3. I don't think we knew that. That's pretty insane. That's very Mozart level, which in fact they address. Also, the fact that he wrote string arrangements for the Beirut album Flying Club Cup, which blew my mind when I heard that, learning from their own podcast. I love the crap out of that album, and all of a sudden that just blew, the collision of worlds. Owen Pallette meets Beirut. One of my favorite albums of all time. Also, the fact that Owen recorded under the name Final Fantasy. Didn't know that, although it's kind of ridiculous that we didn't know that, given we're so immersed in the album. It's so easy to research. It's at the top of the wiki page. First paragraph, in bold.
Well, I think also something important to note with Owen Pallette specifically, though, is that was a fan recommendation. Often when we get fan recommendations, we do some legwork, but it's more about the fan and their experience with it because they're sharing it with us, and then we share it with the world. And when Heather recommended that album, we kind of took it from a perspective of, here's a vague background. Now let's get into this because Heather recommended it.
Exactly. And even my vague background was not as refined back then. I was just kind of let's get to the album. I can't wait to get the album.
But the main thing that we do when we focus on a singular album is we try to review it as a whole in and of itself, just by itself, in the view of how it affects music. Not necessarily a single person's discography, not necessarily a single person's debut or summation of a career or anything like that. Delving into careers does a different sort of turn where we go track by track and say, well, they start here and they evolve and they evolve and they evolve, or maybe they stumble backwards, or something that we heard earlier in the actual album. This is what the guys at A to Z can do. They can go, well, this album was just a rehash of the 2003 such and such.
Exactly,
this
because they're
album was
talking
a
about
nice
it
exposure
right there in the midst of one single discussion. So
yeah.
it's fresh. It's all they take it all at once.
Yeah. It's a very enjoyable sort of macro discussion on like a microcosm.
Also,
well, then again, we go from micro to macro to somewhere in between. I mean, we are probably somewhere in between. We like albums. We love albums. But some podcasts talk about songs. They're a discography.
It's also important to note with this podcast that it's a very casual, as Steve had said earlier. You really get a sense of their personalities as hosts. And I think that's important because I think after 150 episodes, we've more or less cultivated personalities each, although I think we've more or less become caricatures of our personalities to a point. But that kind of tends to happen when you're an on-air personality. That said...
That's important.
It's very important because how these guys come across are just two good friends who want to talk about music.
Brothers, I think.
Oh, brothers. Oh, they're family.
I think. Well, their last name is Ferguson. I assume they're brothers.
But the closeness comes through in the way they discuss, and I really like that. It gives it an earthy kind of homeness that kind of brings you in, like that grassroots thing that you said in jest.
Yes.
It really gives it heart and brings you in because you're like, wow, these guys are really passionate about this stuff, and they're joking, and they're making arbitrary side conversations. It adds a personal...
Some of these conversations seem like they may have been going on for years. it's like the sort of conversations that you sort of walk in on. It's like, oh yeah, no, you're wrong. We were talking about this when I was 7.
The running gags and so
Yeah.
forth. But that's why I really want to get into what you brought up. Entertainment. Entertainment is a big thing with podcasts, and really that was something, if you're just talking about comedy, if you see entertainment in terms of comedy, then that's not really there so much in the first 2 podcasts we just discussed. It's technical, going into deeply emotional, but this is probably one of the funnier ones, and it's not like pre-written jokes or anything. It just comes out of conversation, the natural banter that you would expect. Also, of course, the flaw in this is that sometimes you feel like it's just like goes into so many digressions, and you're just kind of like, going back and forth, and you're kind of getting away from the album itself, because it's all done in such a casual fashion that's just bound to happen. But hopefully, if you like the style, then you'll be on board, and I indeed was on board. So, you take that good with the bad. But also, I want to talk a little bit about some of the tools they use here. Some of the tools they use when they do get more in-depth with the discussion. And that is, of course, something we have never used over the course of podcasting, and that is post-production, background music. Examples. Just hard examples to show what you're talking about. Our whole game here, as I've explained, is to sort of describe, and it's an exercise in imagery. That's like one of the core tenets of how we approach this, is because through imagery we get to kind of connect to the listener themselves and see what imagery they might come up with. We have 3 different people, we have 3 different opinions, but then after that, that's the anchor we need through which to actually start, getting into the analysis and the review portion.
Well, that's also because we've, since the beginning, more or less, as early as we could, have featured the Spotify playlist. So we don't want to play the music for you because we want you to invest in the podcast and work with us.
Exactly. We assume when we make the big assumption that if you're listening to this podcast, you know the album.
Yeah.
You know the album,
and we give you the
have
access to it thanks to Spotify, who
Right.
is truly the one giving you the access.
Exactly.
And
then you have opinions on it, and then you just, you want to soak up as much knowledge on it as possible, or as many opinions on it as possible. That's how a true lover of music goes about it.
But in A to Z, having some background pieces and some examples as they go along works so much better when you're talking about 5, 10, 15 albums spanning decades.
Well, here's an example.
It gives that little bit of extra context for what they're talking about to really drive points home.
Here's an example. When they started covering his more experimental earlier work, which actually really, based on that sample, really inspired me to go back through Owen Palet's catalog. At some point deep into the podcast, because they don't do it, constantly, around 35 minutes or so, they start playing an old Owen Palet track, particularly If I Were a Carp. And they describe it as the track plays. Of course, it's added in post. He just says, all right, I'm going to play it in the background, and then he adds it later. Meanwhile, they're just discussing, knowing well that it will be added. So while this is playing over the course of their discussion, despite of the direction the discussion's going, I'm getting kind of chilled by this track as it's going, and I'm definitely going to be diving in this week, I think, to his older albums. Frankly, it had me more intrigued than some of the things on In Conflict. Despite my feelings on that album, which were pretty strong. But the key thing that had me was when he actually started reading some of the lyrics there. And the lyrics, he described as very Kafka-esque. And suddenly, you really feel the power of the lyrics that we constantly look at whenever we go through albums. And we might explain, well, when they're being sung, the lyrics get lost on you, right? So we read lyrics a lot. But to hear lyrics read by, I believe it was Steve Ferguson, reading these lyrics over the Owen Palet track itself, especially during one of those more harrowing instrumentals, where there are no vocals to sort of interfere with it. Instead, he's just reading the lyrics, and this music is getting more and more tense in the background. That was a pretty great podcast moment, and I'm sure they have it throughout much of the rest of their compendium. It's a big perk. One of the biggest perks I've seen, at least as far as the two-dude podcast, dynamic.
I think what I really overall enjoy about this podcast is, like I said, the kind of setup of it, the nature of it. I think that it's really, if you want someone who's, 2 people who are just having a conversation about music, this is where to go. Though they do have opinions, and at the end really truly do say whether you should probably check it out or not, at its core, it is just a chat. And it's cool to kind of dive into that chat.
It's a chat. It can be a casual chat at times. It can be a heated chat at times. It's all the things you'd expect with a chat. Of course, with us, a lot of times we come to the point where we're talking more to the mic than to each other. That wasn't always that way. I don't know when that happened. It benefits in some ways. It doesn't benefit in other ways. I don't know. See, I don't even see you guys right now. Where are you? I don't know. I see that little green light.
No, that's not true. You're looking back and forth into Matt's deep eyes.
Oh, that's right. That was earlier. No,
Yeah,
but ever
call
since then,
back.
I've edited him out.
Okay.
Edited.
We are not perfect.
You can't make up that stuff. Also, last little thing here, and this is just a little thing I'll throw over to those guys if they ever listen to this. Sound quality wise, they could use a touch or maybe a bundle of compression in their work. Some peakiness I noticed, and believe it, we had our problems with this, especially if you look at those earlier episodes. Please never listen to our earlier episodes. We had the similar problems owing, I think, to the echo of the table, like we recorded on. It would sort of like bounce back at us, and we were using Audacity at the time. That was back when you, Matt, were
doing all of the editing,
all of the editing, and well,
yeah, it wasn't a good idea.
Thanks for giving that to me.
It's okay. You don't have anything else to do, so you know.
No, that's true. Anyway,
This is why you're executive producer and producer.
Yeah.
That's true. You are both.
Anyway, who knows what these guys use, but I do know that, after like episode 30 or something, when I took over, I started using Sonar as our DAW. I sort of applied more and more compression every week. We use a USB mic. It's not high-tech here. At some point, we've shifted to an elk couch. Then at some point, landed back at a table, and this time with padding galore, with a little gap in the early hundreds where we didn't actually have padding, and it went back to being crappy audio again. But now the table's covered, acoustic curtain behind the direction of the mic, and even back in episode 119, when we reviewed Owen Paulette's album In Conflict, we still had similar problems, but after that, it's a little more refined. You get more of a warm sound, which is, I think, important, and, it's something I would just throw by them. It'll eliminate that peakiness, and then all of a sudden you just get the warmth of voices that are just as passionate as ours or the artist in questions.
That's fair enough. The next podcast we're going to talk about is actually one that I brought to the table, not the physical table, the table at large.
Well, the physical table, we're all sitting around it.
That's true, too.
There you go.
The podcast is called Jonah Radio, and anyone who knows me and knows this podcast knows I'm a huge fan of The Nerdist, where I'd first heard Jonah Ray, who's one of the co-hosts sometimes. Jonah Ray, Matt Myra, and of course Chris Hardwick. Jonah eventually, because he often talked about on The Nerdist how much of a music fan he was and how into the indie scene he was. He used to be a drummer, all of this stuff. He someday wanted to do a music podcast, and so he did. He started his own called Jonah Radio. What I like about Jonah Radio is it's kind of a harkening back and also a tongue-in-cheek jab at the really ridiculous radio shows of the 90s. But what I like about this show is that it can be about music, but doesn't have to be. He always features artists that he's interested in playing, usually on a 2 to 3 song level, to break up the show, where he'll just play a song.
And that is very much reflected in their tagline. Joni Ray has some friends over to his house to drink, listen to music, and converse, with sexy results. You can't even.
For someone who, like myself personally, that grew up with 92.3 playing and having the Howard Stern Shock Jock every morning to school, which was probably not the best thing in the world for a young... Every morning.
You started the day with that?
Yeah, in elementary school, having Howard Stern. Yeah, probably not the best thing in the world, but I loved it.
Ladies and gentlemen, your credentials, John Sanders.
Shock Jock. I mean, he... to some extent, coined the phrase shock jock, and this is what they're producing right here. That's what Jonah Radio really seems to be, sort of like a podcast version of such a thing. It's kind of a great idea for a throwback. It really comes off as very off the cuff, which makes it feel very natural when there's a slight little flub when the music doesn't play exactly at the right time. He's got a 2 or 3 second gap to fill up with just a little bit of a spiel. It does seem like it's both conversational and just a fun time, just a bunch of guys hanging out. Exactly their tagline.
Well, there's a spectrum there where you got to decide where you're going to be as a podcaster, and the precedent is partially set by radio, or almost totally set by radio. But of course, podcasts can go in any direction they want from there, using that framework, that frame of reference, and that is: do you want to be NPR? Do you want to have the soft, soothing voice, or are you going to, fart sounds, every other week? I'm not saying it's necessarily what this is. It actually, I don't think Shock Jock is a very fair comparison. I mean, it's not like lewd front to back, but it uses a lot of the same tricks. It's clear there that there's not a lot of post-production stuff going on. He's got a soundboard, and he will press a button on impulse if it suits him, if it pleases his fancy.
And what's also interesting about this is that, he'll have guests that are music related and also sometimes guests that are not. But he always features music, and that's what makes it a music podcast, at least on the larger scale, is he always features 2 or 3 songs. Like, for example, one of the episodes I listened to was when he had both Chris Hardwick, of Nerdist fame, and Weird Al Yankovic on, who's one of Chris's closest friends and has become friends with Jonah. And they talk about music, they talk about movies, they talk about TV, but then he also features several songs, like Lisa by Don't Stop or We'll Die, which is a band made up of comedians who make legit indie rock, not comedy indie rock. He features, of course, Albuquerque by Weird Al, which we talked about on our podcast when we reviewed Running with Scissors. He's building this kind of community show around his fans because he is a comedian. He has a fan base, also from Nerdist. And so he just created a radio show where he can share his music and his friends with those fans. And
let's address the entertainment quality and along those lines. I mean, this is very high quality compared, for instance, to some of the previous ones we looked at. This is the separate mic thing. They are all separately mic'd. He's got a system. He's got a setup. And I really do think that deep down it does improve the entertainment factor because you hear everybody more crisply and you start reacting as if you were in a professional studio. He probably is in a professional studio, even if it's just in his home. He's probably still got a good setup. It also, though, makes it a tad more ubiquitous because then, of course, now that you're kind of being unconsciously, as John is inclined to do, placed in like the shock jock, category, sometimes it's not always what you want. You might not prefer a separate mic, We do pretty good with just one mic, in fact. Actually, sometimes it's more natural for the purposes of a group conversation because you hear everybody nice and evenly, You don't really need a pop filter. You just kind of get the ambiance of the room and the environment in which questions are being hashed out. But then all of a sudden when you're like on the radio and you have like headphones in and it sounds like that's kind of what's going on here, it's a little bit, it changes the tone a little bit. I think it enhances the comedy, but it puts us in a whole different category. You can't do, for instance, what Steve and Doug of Music A to Z were doing. You can't. Right. You just can't be in that environment. You can't be that casual. You are going to be going back and talking to the mic.
Yes. But that said, I mean, this at its core does have a lot of similarities to any other interview show. The only difference is Jonah Ray will always play music. He will always make the artwork for every episode a spoof on an album cover, usually featuring him or a drawing of him. And I think it's really, a mix of the Nerdist meets a music podcast, which I thought was really interesting. And he brings on his friends to talk, but also injects his own personal opinion of music and the bands he wants to share with the world.
It reminds me of Mark Maron.
Yeah,
just a bit.
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
He, of course, is one of the more known comedian podcasters out there. Big series.
Kind of pioneered the genre.
Yeah.
And from my point of view, it's also that final little transition of what I loved about the radio before the radio became what it is today. Making the transition to the new medium. Making the transition to the podcast, the pre-recorded, and the more ubiquitous anybody can get a hold of it area of the internet.
That's just the thing. This really just flat out reminds me of radio. Like, I don't think this is necessarily the kind of thing that... It doesn't need to be a podcast. And that's not to say anything. Of course, many radio shows are simply doubled and copied as podcasts. Because it used to be, well, if you didn't hear it, that's it, lost the time. Yeah. Well, now all of a sudden they're archived. And you can go back and you can get old radio episodes because they're just... the format they arrive in posterity is the podcast.
Well, and all of
That's
NPR,
just what this sounds like.
Just about all of NPR is reproduced as podcasts. Like, there are radio shows that air on NPR, exactly. And they're also featured as podcasts.
And they were the ones who were really quick to pick up on that on that pattern.
So I think, and for me personally, as someone who's met Jonah Ray and who's a fan of his work, it's really cool to kind of get that inside, just like if you're a fan of Chris Hardwick, get that kind of inside personal touch, but still get some music, because he always...
You get the music thrown in there, actually, in the same way you would get it thrown in on a radio series, a radio interview.
Let's take a break, and now, while we're taking a break, here's so-and-so with so-and-so.
And hell, we do that.
Yeah,
we do that. If we have a guest, a lot of times we try to do at least 3 recordings if we can, one in the beginning to sort of jump us off, and then one in between the big album discussion and they're in the interview of them.
Or topic,
and then one at the tail end to send you off. And we time them appropriately. It's the same exact concept. It's just here, it's done... usually live.
Yeah.
Well, not necessarily live. I don't mean live as if they were actually, like, they're playing, but, they're sitting presently, and then all of a sudden it's just like, let's pause, and now as if you just took the mic away for a minute, you have a breather. You have a breather to say, like, this is working, this is not. And you have about 3 minutes to hash that out, then suddenly you're back.
Just like you would on an actual radio show.
Exactly.
From here, though, we can move on to another podcast that Steve had actually recommended.
The Classical Performance Podcast. Well, considering we were talking about NPR, this is on NPR, and it is very, very NPR. It's hosted by Alan McClellan, or at least he hosted this particular episode. I think they have a group of people who actually interview and travel to all the different places. In part, this is a bit of a faux pas because it relates with one of the earlier things I said we were not going to do. There are a lot of classical performance podcast episodes which are, in fact, just music. All right, and that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about podcasts that actually look at the discussions that take place. But there are a few that stand out here when they get the chance to interview with the performer themselves, usually just before, usually just after. They don't seem to take place in a studio, but instead more in a music hall environment as they are about to perform. So, in this case, I looked at an episode, which is fairly recently. It was just the episode before last, as of the time this is aired, or maybe 2 episodes before last, as the time this airs. Bach, with Sergei Shepkin. And particularly, it's on a certain piece, or something he knows a lot about as a performer. The Capriccio on the departure of his most beloved brother. And that would be Bach's most beloved brother, who was a brother who had volunteered to the King of Sweden and his army as an oboe player in the army band. And at some point, he passed away around 1704, and that's when this piece was written. It deeply moved Bach, and Bach was not the kind of composer who really did a lot of this stuff, who really, this is something I'm composing based on my life. At the time, this was called programmatic music, music that really, really attempts to tell a story over its course. This is 1704 we're talking about here. We don't even get close to talking about, even though as a classical background guy, I would, of course, love to have this opportunity over the course of what we do, but, yeah, we don't get the opportunity. We like to stay current and see even, what a contemporary classical composer might be doing right now. We stay current. But here, we're going back, we're reaching into the past, and we're doing to a 1704 piece what we still might do, and speak about the different sections and the different movements and how they impact the listener and what's being done. Part education and part analysis.
But one of the most intriguing little parts that happens during the course of this podcast is there's discussion, and then the words sadness in major get done, and then all of a sudden we hear the piano. And that little bit, that right there was more education about what something like sadness in major could represent than anything else I've ever really heard when talking to musicians.
And this really hits harder the question of, the challenges that we have, despite that we have that niche of course, trying to be exercising our imagery and being as descriptive as possible. This is similar to, what Music A to Z was trying to do by playing Owen Pallette in the background. You don't have to do too much description. They get it out of the way there, but the music will speak for itself in the background. Here, this is even more technical because this is a performer who intimately knows Bach's work, and he knows this piece really well, and he can play excerpts of it on a dime and show the interviewer right there, show a foreign interviewer, because of course, on Music A to Z, well, they know each other, so they know what they're talking about, and they're on the same page. But this is more of he's talking to a studio audience in the process, so everything is done really on the spot, and it commands a lot of talent over the part of the performer, because of course that's just flat out difficult, to pull certain sections of pieces on a dime, and especially talk about them intelligently in the process. You have to have so much of an intimate knowledge as you go in.
When you say something like 26 accidents crossing the Rhine, I believe was the exact
A piece was 26 accidents crossing the Rhine, based on the fact that, well,
it's all mis-keys. He goes all through random tonals, and the way he explains it, and explains the history behind how this came to be as sort of both an aesthetic and a piece itself, combining that with the actual musical representation was just so beautiful when you hear the music and can kind of get a whole new definition to what you're hearing.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, what he's doing is he's walking through the history of Bach's brother. Bach himself was doing that in the piece, and he's going through, this kind of like trying to give him a whole overview of his life. They described it as the kind of thing, that a mother might tell her child before they go off into the world, you're going to have falls, you're going to fall down. It's a very, very emotional way of, telling the story about how someone left home and then ultimately landed where they are, which which is deceased, you know, and all this is done through music, and he shows this in excerpts as we go, because it's a challenging thing, especially this is a lot of thing that turns people away from classical, is they have a hard time making these connections, making these leaps, and these interpretations from the music itself. Commentary can be very helpful and very educational for someone who has a vested interest.
Well, also, the obvious thing here is they can't interview the artist. Bach is no longer with us.
Yeah.
So
yeah, this
is the next closest step. And when you take someone who's intimately knowledgeable about a piece of work that's not their own, but they studied it like it's their own, there's still it's almost like you're talking to Bach, because it's history, it's fact, and they can talk about it as if they're presenting it as if they're that artist, which is very interesting when you go to a contemporary artist where they are also presenting it as fact as the artist. But this is very different.
In a way, it's a combination of most of the podcasts that we just discussed, minus maybe Jonah Hill. Excuse me, Jonah
Ray.
Jonah Hill.
No.
A little
Jonah Ray.
Error there. But it's certainly a combination of the first three. You know, it's got that emotional core, it's got that technical core, and it's got the, you know, show by example element of Music A to Z.
As well as what all three sort of
that
combine together.
even the first two.
It's even got the history. It delves into those little tidbits, like at one point he says Bach wasn't the originator of all classical music. I mean,
well, he's not the originator of every idea that's ever been proposed.
That's exactly it. And it's kind of interesting to hear somebody that obviously knows his Bach, that obviously enjoys his Bach, and to say, well, everyone's preconceived idea that Bach is the father may not be 100% true. It's also a little bit candid that way. I mean, there's all these little things that start coming in, that bleeding in, where it becomes an amalgamation and a great insight into just classical music, which doesn't get touched upon enough in our society nowadays.
True.
Well, and also this kind of connects to our episode last week, where we were talking about classical music and cartoons and how that was a way of educating people back then. This is a modern way of educating people. Yes, it's not in a cartoon. Instead, it's a separate podcast featuring that music, but it's talked about in and I'd say the way it actually compares to Jonah Radio and A to Z is that it's talked about in a very casual way. Even though they cover some technical stuff, they're not spouting jargon. They are presenting it in a casual and relatable way.
It's a casual
some jargon in there.
There is some
jargon,
but it's not unapproachable.
Yeah. It's not a professor in the lecture hall. It's a professor at the bar explaining things to his student.
Well, it's a professor with a go-between, which is the interviewer herself, as it relates to the audience present. So, you know, you have that pattern. Of course, it can be very technical, but I would challenge you on one thing here. I think that this is not necessarily the kind of thing that someone would just pick up out of the blue. Like, for instance, say, you guys, you listen to it somewhat at my behest. Because, of course, well, this is something I would like to look at. It's probably not something you would really go into just by chance. Because you have to have a little bit of background. And I do think that this NPR style, as much as I really love it, and I do think it can pack the most education, per minute, which is what I really appreciate. I do think that it can keep a lot of people away because it's just so, soft and yet also talking about a foreign subject, especially Baroque music is not, it's not common to a lot of people today. A lot of people aren't like in that ilk.
But see, what I would say, though, is the difference between this and discovering it on our own is because it's an NPR show. A lot of NPR shows, when you're listening to podcasts on NPR or you pull up NPR online, it just jumps from show to show to show. So while you might have been listening to Ask Me Another, it may then go jump into this show, and where you were not intending to hear it, it was on the program list, it comes up, and you go, oh, this is actually really interesting.
True.
And then you go after it. Whereas all of these other shows that we mentioned are not part of a network. They are independent on their own. This is under the umbrella of NPR, which is a great way to connect to stuff you may not know you're interested in.
Good point. And in truth, it is a very popular podcast. It's usually featured on, high on the list of both iTunes music category for podcasts, and also if you're already in NPR. It's going to be high on the list, and you might be intrigued. But, it's really all about the tools in which... The tools that he uses, obviously, that showing the example of like a sad major key piece, is something that I could say here on the podcast, and it'll all just have us kind of curious, be like, well, major's supposed to be happy, and I can just say, well, this is a great example of it, but how do you know if you haven't heard it? Of course, we do kind of expect that you've already heard it, you know, and we can just describe it for the sake of as a perk, as something that really, really aids to the piece itself, because that's so challenging to do, or at least not instinctual on the part of the composer. And he can show that right there to everyone else. It's all so much like back and forth connection. Play the piano, explain. Play the piano, explain. You know, that's just something you're not going to get in too many instances. Also, in the process, you get like great musical terms that you wouldn't get otherwise. You know, intriguing passages. Again, also experimenting with imagery, as we do.
From here, we go to another podcast, because that's what we're doing here today, called Sound Opinions. Now, I like to call Sound Opinions, and if you guys are listening, hi. They are our bizarro cousins from somewhere else that's not here. I say that because their format is similar to ours in the respect that they do a review and they do a topic.
Now you're going to hurt Music A to Z's feelings. I just called them our West Coast Canadian brethren.
Well, these are bizarro clones of us. Think like Superman and Bizarro Superman.
He may not get the comic reference.
That's true.
Think of it as the Star Trek, like, they're wearing goatees.
Oh, all right, yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
So they do a topic and they do a review, but they do it in the reverse order that we do. They do the topic first, and then they do the review. Also, what's interesting is they go into a very in-depth topic with notes and bullet points and all of this stuff, and go very deep into it. And then the review tends to be shorter, very condensed. And whereas we are very big, active note takers and heavy descriptors of our album review, but our topics tend to be more on the cuff and on the fly.
In short. Long review. For us, long review, short topic. Them, short review, long topic.
And in the case, we actually all listened to one podcast that, well, it was all right up our alley. Going Solo and the opinions on Modest Mouse, the new album that we actually reviewed as well.
And Going a Solo is a topic we've done where we talk about artists who were really great or bad when they were with a band, and then how they progressed on their own.
And they actually brought up a lot of the same pieces that we brought up. And it was kind of interesting seeing them sort of going on the soapbox and really going into how the artist kind of saved or ruined their career by going solo. To hear them actually take our topic and turn it in some cases on our head, but also say a lot of the same things. It was kind of self-affirming to hear them say a lot of the same things I've said.
Yeah, I mean, they start off with the same spiel, like as in our topic segments, a kind of thesis that's like fluffed up with all these questions, you know, these are the things we're looking at, you know, well, what are the challenges that a solo artist might face and so forth. All these things, he presents that in a way like I might write it in the blurb and then talk about it as just before we really jump off into the discussion. And then it becomes very conversational. But I noticed that there's a thing here. When they get to the review section, and don't get me wrong, I love their topic sections. I think they get a chance to be more thorough than we have, since we're like at the tail stretch of we're burned out from the review, we've been immersed in it, and now it's like, what, now we have to talk broadly? I have to remember things? But for them, you know, they get that out of their system, and then it's almost like the review they're burned out, and they're just sort of like regurgitating what their last impressions were. It's not much analysis here. It seems almost like pre-written spiels, you know?
Yeah, I think that their goal with the reviews is not so much to... they rate the album on a much broader scale, and I think the goal is to just pretty much say, I listened to this album, this is how I feel about it, this is how I rate it. It's not so much the intricate analysis of it, but just impressions, result, and that's it.
And in that sense, it's sort of like Siskel and Ebert.
Yeah.
Like, that's exactly the way the old show...
it definitely came off that way.
The old half-hour show that they used to have, you know, back in the 90s, where they would go through several movies over the course of that half-hour segment. And obviously, how long can you spend on a movie? So essentially what you have is monologue from Siskel, monologue from Ebert. Maybe they'll have one little back-and-forth go-between, like a 101 as far as debate is concerned. He counters, the other guy counters, and in the end, it's a thumbs up, thumbs down, and that's it. And that's exactly the way these two guys go about these reviews.
It reminds me of something I actually used to do on the show. If you go back and listen to the album somewhere in the nebulous middle of our run, I would give an overall simplistic rating of the album after we kind of reviewed it. But I realized it was kind of counterintuitive to what we did. While there was nothing wrong with doing that, you know, buy it, burn it, praise it.
Yeah.
I felt like it was kind of
Oh,
redundant.
I forgot about that.
I did it for a while. It was inspired to me by actually a YouTuber that I watch who reviews games. His name is The Completionist, Gerard. And he does like this big long video about a game, and then at the end he surmises it. But the difference is it's the whole video is leading to that. Whereas us, we were giving our ratings and then I was doing that. It just seems superfluous after a while, so I stopped doing it. But this here, it definitely seems like that's what they're doing. It's, and one reviewer said that he'd trash it, and the other one said buy it. It's essentially just giving a very simple perspective on how you should feel about the album and how you should go about it.
Very divergent.
Yeah.
And that's a case where, for anyone, that is, I guess, because there is a lot of that out in the market,
Sure.
I definitely think that as far as sound opinions goes, I'm not sure I would go to them for their reviews. I can confidently say that. But I would go to them for their topics and their interviews. Because there was another episode I looked at them, and this was Laura Jane Grace of Against Me and Blur. Well, the Blur thing is beside the point because it's the same exact spiel as Modest Mouse, monologue, react, done. But the interview of Laura Jane Grace put into his perspective a lot of things, and we reviewed their album Transgender Dysphoria Blues back in episode 81, and it was a trick, but also I remember, we didn't have the same perspective on it at the time. I realized that this thing has been played a lot ever since then, and it's kind of grown on me ever since, and especially to emerge into Laura's whole spiel on what was going behind that, because of course we know it's very, very on the nose as far as a transgender dysphoria process, since she was going through it right at that moment, but it's to hear this interview from an experienced interviewer, I think, again, more that from the horse's mouth perspective, this is the kind of thing that I also feel like this does as well here as it would do on Tap to Music, for instance. And I feel like you get some of the same things, and this is where it's really going to cut with artists like this and albums like this that have such a big impact, especially if it's a personal album.
I want to make something very clear here that we are talking about these podcasts as listeners. We are not the end-all, be-all of podcasts. Like we like to preface every once in a while with our reviews. We're just telling you how we feel as a listener of podcasts. I think that their review style is designed for the kind of person who wants a quick and dirty review. They're not looking for intricate details. They just want to know, well, what did this guy think? Yeah. And that's not what we do anyway. So I don't think that their review is better. Their review style is better or worse. It's just a different breed. And if you want that quick and dirty, get it or don't get it, go to them, because that's what they do. And I mean, whether it's how accurate it is or not, you're not looking for accuracy. You're looking for two dudes' opinions, and they give that.
Which is why I immediately shifted the discussion to the interview. But, it's take what you can get it. Frankly, it's right there in the title. Sound opinions. How broad can you get there, They know that they're trying to tackle a lot, just like we're trying to tackle a lot. And, you're going to run into similar problems.
Final podcast that we've listened to would be Completely Beatles, part of the SneakyDragon.com network. It is sadly a podcast that is now over, but it did something a little bit unique and a little bit right up our alley. What they did was, Ian Boothby and David Dedrick, they reviewed the Beatles albums in chronological order. And this is a very curious thing because we've talked a couple of times off air and a lot of times on air about doing retro reviews, about going back and picking our favorite XYZ albums from way back when growing up, such and such. What they actually did was very similar to what we do when we do an album review. We go track by track, song by song, and talk about it within the context of the album itself. In particular, I fell in love with their Sgt. Pepper's review. But what's curious is, while we are attempting to go analytical with all these new albums,
we're very close to the album.
Yeah.
In their case, Completely Beatles seems to really step out of that and attempt more of a documentary style thing. It's a lot more, again, combination of various aspects we've talked about today, and that brings us to, where was the artist at the time that they were writing this? And that's it's also common knowledge, just like we were talking about Bach. Well, frankly, as far as 20th century culture is concerned, the Beatles have achieved the same level of mystique. So it's common fact, especially ever since the Beatles anthology was released, everybody kind of knows what the Beatles were doing at certain moments in their career. You can go over this stuff again, and you can kind of combine that with the analysis that we do. And that, I think, seems to sum up what Completely Beatles is over the course of the podcast that were finite. There are only so many Beatles albums, and so the podcast is a mini-series. It ends. Yeah,
and it was a very interesting story of, well, they wrote this song, and then this was the meaning that they said about it, but there's also things you can refer about it, and they brought in instruments with that song that were a little bit different and a little bit more unique. And listening to it, just as a fan, I would love to see other people doing this for other albums, for other locations and styles of music and other bands, because it's sort of bringing, once again, the same way that classical performance brought in Bach and classical music to the modern day. It's reintroducing the Beatles to this generation.
Right.
And other bands really need to have that happen to them. It would be great to see someone really delve into Elvis Presley. It would be great to see someone delve into Miles Davis. It would be great to see people approaching the history and trying to redesign it and reintroduce it to modern day people, to the people who may not have heard it before.
You're proposing a series of miniseries.
A series of miniseries, yeah, as essentially, that in a nutshell.
I mean, I think that would, especially the names that you threw around there, it would really only be appropriate, I think, for the greats or the ones who've indelibly edged their name into history.
And it would be just an interesting idea to not just see the evolution of the band, but to see it and how it can sort of have repercussions on today's music as well.
I think it's also important to note that this podcast is not trying to redesign the wheel as far as the music they're reviewing. Like, they're doing in-depth research and telling stories about the Beatles, which you can get other places as well.
The fact that When I'm 64 was actually a song that they used to sing when the music used to go out, when the electrical went out, when they were touring in Germany. Why they stopped touring in between, right before they started doing Sgt. Pepper's. How, what's it called? Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields were both written before Sgt. Pepper's and both influenced the album when you're looking at Paul's side. But John was actually going in a completely different direction. To really see the personality of the Fab Four come across in the music they were making at the time they were making it.
Well, I would wager that these guys probably do come out with stuff that hasn't been covered in the Beatles anthology, and also probably that there will be more stuff coming out about the Beatles throughout the 21st century. I mean, it's just endless fascination.
And also the idea that it's being done by fans. They are clearly fans of the Beatles. They are not partial. The impartial judges of the music. And they love the Beatles.
You don't have to argue that it's a draw also because it's the Beatles.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that they're taking a complete discography of one of the most famous bands of all time will be a draw. But I think...
Oh, I see. It's a cheap shot now.
No. It's the fact they actually do it justice. They really do show that they have a lot of heart and soul in what they're talking about here.
They are fans of the music, but they are still objective enough to go and recognize what works and what doesn't in the pantheon of Beatles. They're not comparing it to the pantheon of music. I don't think that's the goal.
Nah.
The goal is to compare it to other Beatles works and just chronologically go over what they did and why it worked and why it didn't.
So there is a distinct, they'll address something if they don't think it worked.
Yeah, they did talk about it, and even on Sgt. Pepper, which... while everybody's favorite Beatles album is, in fact, the best Beatles album, in my humble opinion, they talked about how When You Have Within You, Without You was kind of a not very good starter to the B-side.
I think that was the end of the...
No, it was the beginning.
Yeah, you're right, it was the beginning of the B.
And to have it go into some of the more interesting pieces. I mean, you leave off with For the Benefit of Mr. Kite, which coincidentally... John Lennon actually wrote viewing a poster from a circus that was for, quote, the benefit of Mr. Kite, and half those lines are drawn from that poster that he had above the piano. A great story. I loved hearing it.
Well, I do. I hear what you say about, the Within You, Without You thing, and I think that's almost the reaction that just about everyone had when they listened to that album, or at least what's been passed through time. I feel like I feel that way about that track, less because I felt it when I first heard it, but because I heard my parents say the same thing. It's the kind of thing that passes through. It's like, yeah, that's kind of a throwaway. But then I learned to sort of appreciate it. I don't know. It's that flavor of 1967. Despite that, I remember completely Beatles makes that point too. That not everything was a flavor of the year. It was a flavor of what the Beatles were doing in that singular moment, and it doesn't really define anything as a whole. They were impulse followed by impulse.
And a lot of their earlier albums were flavors of the year, and a lot of the later albums were flavors of the year, where you can actually define the album by a specific thing. But orchestral, no, that's just a specific song. Sitar, no, that's just a specific song. Organs, no, that's just a specific song part from that one little bit that was on a B-side. It was the reason why that was my favorite favorite episode they did. It was an incredible insight into just the stories and sort of like the myth and the history surrounding the Fab Four.
The idea that we're probably not going to get a podcast where all the Beatles discuss anything because we've lost some of them. But this is the next best thing because they're citing specific stories of the Beatles.
Right.
Now I'm going to ask to wrap up our conversation on this podcast a very polarizing question that I don't think's actually come up on the air. I want us all to say who our favorite Beatle is. Not why, because that'll take us on a road that we will never finish.
How fitting we get to
We've all talked
end
about
our
our
discussion
favorite.
and,
I think so.
and our episode with a Beatles discussion.
But I would like for the fans to know, because I don't honestly remember either, who everyone's favorite Beatle is.
Nowhere Man Something. George Harrison is a god amongst mortals. Period.
George Harrison is also my favorite Beatle. Here Comes the Sun is one of the most beautiful, truly sweet songs ever written.
While it is unfair to say that the Beatles would exist without any Beatle, of course.
Sure, of course.
I want to say very, very firmly, and it's not a new thought by any stretch, that the Beatles would not exist by any stretch without Paul McCartney.
Okay. Well, I'm
Paul
not
McCartney,
asking
and
their
I- and I-
existence. I'm asking your favorite.
My favorite Beatle is Paul McCartney.
Okay.
I believe that is what really, really etched them into time because of his ditties, as you know, John Lennon once sort of.
He was a slice of life guy.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
It was a
Eleanor
slice of
Rigby.
life, and John Lennon was going for something greater, perhaps, but more in meaning as opposed to sound. Paul McCartney is the source of a lot of that sound. To say nothing for his later work, and you can kind of tell because of his later work. You can tell because of the stuff that Paul McCartney did in the 70s that he was a big, big part of the Beatles. He's my favorite because he was also the Renaissance man. I know that George Harrison did a lot. I know that John Lennon did a lot. Paul McCartney did just a little bit more. If he had to stretch his tentacles into something else, he would. He learned piano for the sake of the Beatles project, and then would hand it off graciously to the fifth Beatle, which was, keyboard guy. The keyboard guy, remember the keyboard guy?
Yes, remember the keyboard guy. Leave it to Steve to take a question I asked and completely ignore what I asked.
He's my favorite Beatle!
Yes, but then you went on to do a spiel about why he's the best Beatle, and that's not what I asked.
Oh, well, yeah, well...
I don't know. George Martin was a great
Egos.
Beatle.
I do like, though,
Still
that
throwing our
none of
balls
us
around.
mentioned John Lennon, which I enjoy that. Cause
John
that's a lot
Lennon
of
was the
people that-
writer. He was the author of so much stuff, but John Lennon, his wordsmithing, and he was one of the people that I fell in love with because of the way he was able to write his words. He was greater because of the other parts that were integral to the Beatles. It's just that his songs did not impact me the way George did.
I think John Lennon was the icing on the cake.
I'm stopping this discussion now because it will be another 2 hours before we stop,
That's right,
which
right.
is what I was trying to
Now we're
avoid.
And nobody
now we're just
mentions
being
Ringo,
vague.
Well,
which is so
vague as hell.
sad.
Poor
It's
family. Google the...
Hey, Ringo was exactly what the Beatles needed.
Yeah, it's true.
the funny man who could keep rhythm.
Shut up.
And did a hell of a job doing so.
Anyway,
I don't want my drum solos in Beatles.
I really hope you guys enjoyed this discussion of contemporary podcasting to us. I mean, we really wanted to kind of just show where we are as an audience. I mean, I've mentioned many podcasts on this podcast, like Comedy Film Nerds, which I interviewed Graham Elwood from, who's also a comedian.
And
the
of
Nerdist,
course, the Nerdist,
which I never shut up about.
Oh, did you bring up the Nerdist at least 5 times this episode? I believe so. I believe you did.
Nerdist. Now I did.
Okay.
Anyway, it was important for us to kind of, I think at this point, express that, you know, we're always trying to express that we're people who just do this because we like doing it, but we also wanted to show that we've listened to other shows that we might think you like, and the end goal today was nothing but to promote people who we feel are in our vein. We want you to have options and listen to other music stuff
In our
besides
vein,
us.
doing something different, doing something unique in its own right.
Yes. I want to take a moment, of course, to thank all the guests we had over the last podcast year, which is not the same as the calendar year, both on Autographs and on the main show. I am not going to thank everyone by name because then I will leave somebody out, and I refuse to do that.
There's a lot of you.
Yes. Secondly, of course, as every year, I want to thank my co-hosts.
Wait, you want to thank all the guests? I can do this.
Can you?
Yeah,
Thank
back to win.
So thank every guest from now until the episode 50 and Autographs. Can you do both?
From episode 50 to present?
Yes.
Episode 50 to present. Thank you, Painless Parker. Thank you, Nate Ryder, again, second time, not including the first, because I know what you asked in the confines of that. Thank you, Hops. Thank you, Sarah Biz. Thank you, Kim and Sage of Head Over Heels.
Head over
Feels. I caught the pun and said the pun wrong. Thank you, Suzanne Pike of the Barbaric Yops. Thank you, Lewis Logic. Thank you, Mark and Chuck of Afterbirth Monkey. Thank you, J. Robert Coppola, as we billed him in that particular episode, a.k.a. Joe Rude. Thank you, Galatea, the living statue. Thank you, Molly Herbert Wilson. Thank
Bear
you...
Wilson.
Yeah, well, okay. Nicknames. You didn't ask for nicknames. Thank you, Rashmi. Thank you, Sheriff of the Dark Lord. Thank you, Circadian Clock. Thank you, Kita Sincere, for the second time. Thank you, Painless Parker, for the second time, even within the confines of this. Thank you... Oh, wait, I missed Tony Catalano. He's a member of us, and I missed Tony Catalano. Thank you, Tony Catalano. Then thank you, Painless Parker. And finally, thank you...
Robert?
Robert, yeah, Robert
Yeah.
James Prinebush, as it's pronounced.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, because you explained that to me. 'Cause
Don't forget-
Interesting because it's bi. Think
Yes.
bi, B-U-Y-P-R-U-Y.
He's just doing things now.
Now I'm just like Stalin, yeah. And finally, thank you, Devin Jackson Mullen and Andy Heidel and Chuck and Ed of Fermented Zen and Bounce, though non-respectively because I said that in the wrong order. Thank you.
As far as autographs goes,
I might speed that up.
I don't know that I can thank all of the guests, but I do want to make a special thank you, if she's listening, to Shauna. Shauna is my contact at Pavement Records, and a lot of the guests on autographs have been through my personal connection to certain musicians, but supplemented by Shauna. She is connected with me with many artists, like Spider One of Powerman 5000, Ryan McCombs of Soil, Mark Young of Head PE, an episode that's coming out the week this airs. I'm interviewing Alexis Brown of Straight Line Stitch. She's provided with many, many artists to interview, and it's been a pleasure working with her, and I hope they continue to come in, because it's also a great way for me to discover new artists as well. I, of course, also want to thank the fans who listen. We appreciate your feedback, comments. I also want to thank people who've recommended albums, from Kristen Vislaki to Star F to Heather and everyone in between that we've had recommend albums. You validate us because you show that you care enough to not only listen, but then
Want our opinion on something you like and or hate. Sometimes hate.
We haven't read it, but in the new season we will. Star F, thank you for your thesis explaining why you liked our episode and giving your points as well. You are the first person to ever do that. So thank you. It means a lot to us, tremendously. Also, I want to just preview quickly, like I've done in these episodes, guests coming up. I have Joe Benjamin of Joe and the Mighty Hand. He's going to be joining us in July. And then, as it's been prophesized, in the month of August, in the final Monday, it's the return of the Wizard. For his third time on Crash Chords podcast, we will have Nelson Lugo.
Yay. I can't wait.
He's coming back, and he's going to bring us...
nerd.
I'm hoping he's still bringing the album he planned on trolling us with the last time he was going to come on when he had to cancel.
Which one?
He never told me, so we'll see.
Surprise troll.
Look forward to that. I did mention Alexis Brown, who I interviewed the week this went up. So check that out on Autographs. That's coming up on its 1 year, which I can't believe I've been doing that for a year also. And now I will go into our album for next week. It's my choice again, and this is an artist continuing in a theme that Steve started, of very talented female composers who are also artists in the pop-ish genre. If I mention this band's name, you will definitely know them. They've done tons of music, and they are very well known and very popular.
Florence and the Machine?
Correct.
Ah.
They have a brand new album, and the album is called How Big, How Blue, How Beautiful. Florence and the Machine is one of those bands that certain songs can immediately make me cry on cue every single time. She has beautiful, beautiful, striking vocals, and I'm so excited to do their album in the vein of both St. Vincent and My Brightest Diamond. Florence and the Machine is in that vein, and so I'm excited to add that to
Very interesting.
the catalog.
They are not a band I have gone into in depth. I really only heard the hits in passing. I like them all. Let's look at the album.
Same here, yeah, same. I've never actually delved into them. So it'll be interesting.
So it should definitely be interesting. So that's what we're bringing
But if
you
you're
next
putting
week.
them on St. Vincent and My Brightest, I mean, you're promising a lot right up front.
I know
You
I know I
kind
am. Based on their previous works, it is on par. So we'll see what the new works is.
Also, it'll be on episode 151, which is exactly 100 episodes after Godsticks.
Wow.
He's really waiting for that new Godsticks album.
Oh, emergence.
It's
I'm waiting for it to emerge.
It's coming.
That's okay, Vice Quadrant, the new space rock opera, is been announced that it's actually coming out this year.
Steam Power Draft.
Yeah, I know. It's great.
So again, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for celebrating 3 years with us. And remember, music is life.
And life is good.
If you enjoyed this and other album analyses, topics, and guests, please subscribe to the Crash Chords podcast on iTunes, where you can also rate us and review us. For more media, also subscribe to Matt's one-on-one interview series, Crash Chords Autographs. To receive emails on all new content, subscribe at the top of our homepage. Also receive updates by liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter at Crash Chords Web, our Tumblr, and our YouTube channel. And remember, keep the discussion going, because music is life, and life is good. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them in the comment board below each post. Otherwise, email us directly at admin@crashchords.com.